The Harvard Chan School hosts a diverse array of speakers invited to share both scholarly research and personal perspectives. They do not speak for the school, and hosting them does not imply endorsement of their views, organizations, or employers.
Welcome. I'm Carrie Baker. I'm the Sylvia DeGlosh Bauman Chair of American Studies and a professor in the program for the study of women and gender at Smith College. I'm also the author of a forthcoming book, Abortion Pills, U.S. History and Politics. I'll be your moderator today. We're living through a volatile moment. 2 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court ruled in a case trying to ban abortion pills nationwide. Just 2 hours ago, the Supreme Court handed down an opinion in a case about whether pregnant people should be able to access emergency medical care in hospitals that receive Medicare funding. Pregnant people in many states now face huge barriers to abortion access, and we're seeing rising threats to other aspects of reproductive health, including contraception and fertility treatments. Joining me for this important conversation are four people: Antonia Biggs, Associate Professor and Social Psychologist with the research group Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health at UCSF; Beth Brinkmann, Senior Litigation Director at the Center for Reproductive Rights; Stella Dantas, President of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists; and Brittany Fonteno, President and CEO of the National Abortion Federation and former President and CEO of Planned Parenthood Arizona. So let's begin with a look at where we are now. Beth, I want to start with you to set the stage for us. In the wake of the Dobbs decision, what's the current landscape of abortion access?
Thank you, Carrie. It's a pleasure to be here and join this discussion. I'm going to focus on that landscape in state law at the moment because we'll be discussing later the two recent U.S. Supreme Court cases. Across the country, 14 states now have almost complete bans on abortion since the 2022 overruling of Roe. Another 10 have significant restrictions, including some with prohibitions after as early as 6 weeks. Some states are trying to reach beyond their own borders and criminalize action by those who help others to travel out of state to obtain abortion care. There was a recent favorable ruling by a federal court in Alabama on that, and there's litigation in Idaho and Texas pending. There are dozens of lawsuits across the country challenging the harsh state bans and restrictions. I'm going to highlight 3 types here very quickly. We at the center of lawsuits contending that the purported medical exceptions to these harsh state bans are unlawfully vague and narrow. We're demonstrating that abortion is healthcare and those exceptions don't work. We won in a trial court in Texas, but the Texas Supreme Court last month reversed. It ruled against 20 patients who were denied or delayed abortion care under the harsh Texas bans, despite having life-threatening pregnancy complications. Some nearly died, and all were subjected to unnecessary harm and suffering. We have similar cases pending right now in Tennessee, North Dakota, and Idaho to vindicate rights of our clients under the laws of those states. Another type of lawsuit that's currently pending are challenging state regulations and restrictions on abortion care, such as delay periods, restrictions against advanced practice clinicians, and mandatory misleading counseling. On a brighter note, the last group I'll mention is that we've seen wins in numerous states on voter initiatives that have amended state constitutions to protect abortion rights. We just won this week the first case in Michigan where we're enforcing the new constitutional right to abortion under the state constitution in Michigan and got enjoined various restrictions about abortion care there.
Yeah, that's encouraging. I mean, we've won all of the ballot initiatives so far, as far as going in a pro-choice direction, and there's going to be quite a number on the November elections, including in key swing states like Florida and Arizona, but other states like New York as well. So it's exciting. Beth, I have another question related, which is we'll talk more about the threats to access in the second half of our conversation, but I do want to ask you briefly about Project 2025. It's a policy roadmap for a future conservative administration. Beth, can you describe the future that Project 2025 envisions?
Well, Project 2025 is an exhaustive and very lengthy plan to restrict individual rights very broadly in unprecedented and undemocratic means. For reproductive rights, it demonstrates that a hostile new federal administration could take actions through federal agencies, for example, such as the FDA and HHS, without any congressional involvement against not just only abortion, but also against contraceptive and assisted reproductive care. I'll just give you a few examples. FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, could act to restrict access to medication abortion, roll back approval. It also could act to restrict contraceptives, again, disregarding science, to reclassify emergency contraceptive or IUDs as abortifacients. HHS could act to eliminate insurance requirements for contraceptives. It also could expand rights to refuse care. And as I think will be discussed a bit later, the agencies could try to develop a type of personhood right from the point of fertilization. That's similar to a recent Alabama ruling that most folks probably heard about that recognized rights for extrauterine children. Those are the kind of executive branch actions that could be anticipated under that plan.
That's terrifying. So I want to turn to Brittany. Brittany, how are pregnant people being affected by the restrictions already in place now?
That's a really great question. So my organization, the National Abortion Federation, or NAF, runs the National Abortion Hotline, which is the country's largest abortion fund. We provide information, financial assistance, and practical support for people accessing abortion care. So we know that abortion bans don't actually erase the need that people have for abortion care. They just make it harder for people to access this essential health care. And even before, when Roe was the law of the land, people from the most marginalized communities were not able to access abortion care. We've only seen that be exacerbated by the slew of state-level abortion bans that have come after the Dobbs decision. We've seen the patient need truly skyrocket, and bans force people to travel to access care. 21 states have banned abortion in some capacity, leaving 21 million women of reproductive age without access to care in their states. Last year, the National Abortion Hotline funded 106,000 people to access abortion care. And in the first half of this year, the hotline has spent $6 million per month to fund abortion care and over $200,000 per month on funding patients' travel, which is up from about $30,000 to $50,000 per month pre-Dobbs. This is still not enough to fully meet the patient need. There is devastation, anger, fear, anxiety, and so many other really valid and complex emotions that come with patients being forced to flee their communities to access care. We know that bans impact people from marginalized communities the most, and this is really by design, and I think very important for us to think about. There's a study called the Turnaway study that I know that we'll talk a little bit more about later today, but it showed that when a person is denied access to an abortion, the consequences can be devastating and life-changing. It includes financial, educational, stability, and job opportunity impacts, as well as negative outcomes for future children. These bans also really deeply impact abortion providers whose job it is to support people in providing compassionate, equitable, and evidence-based care, and really supporting patients in making their own best decisions for their bodies and their lives. What we're of our NAF members who are providers is that they fear criminalization for doing the jobs that they were trained to do. And so there's many more things that I could say, but I know that we have a lot to talk about today.
Thank you, Brittany, for your incredible work. All right, I want to turn to Stella now. Stella, how are these restrictions impacting the health of pregnant people?
Well, thanks for that question. And Brittany touched on some of that. So first, abortion is essential reproductive health care. Abortion is provided for a number of reasons. We use it as well for miscarriage management and to care and the care of pregnant people. Physicians, such as myself, we are trained in what we should be able to provide patients, trained in the evidence, in science. And these decisions are being made by people who are not trained, right? They're not trained in the science. They don't have a medical degree. They don't have the education. They don't have the years of training that we have. And when a patient and a clinician is talking through what is best for their health, we give them the menu of options in front of them. And it is a very private decision that they do to weigh what is best for them and their futures. So as we have pregnant people in states with bans where there are restrictions that are not based in science, then physicians and clinicians, their hands are tied as to what they can counsel a patient on. There's confusion in the laws. There's confusion for both patients when they can seek care. Where should they seek care? Do they need to leave the state? And then for physicians, and then you get into a critical time where you have to act in minutes. It's a life-threatening situation. There's delays in care again because of the confusion of what you can actually counsel a patient on what they can do. So your hands are tied as to really giving them all the full options and what every patient deserves. And as patients need to travel, so there are medical conditions that will deteriorate. So instead of being able to take care of a patient right in front of you, take care of a patient that you've developed a relationship with. Patients trust the clinicians and physicians that they have cared for. They then need to travel. Some of them don't have the means, as Brittany talked about, are marginalized populations. They may not have the transportation. They may not have the childcare. And then that further delays in care. Their conditions may deteriorate, and then they're suffering more morbidity and mortality. So I really, while we don't have the exact data yet, as all of this is happening in real time, we may see poorer outcomes with both complications and both deaths, as patients are forced to wait or they don't have all the options available to them, depending on the zip code or the state they live in.
Yeah. Wow. And this decision that came down this morning, of course, is very relevant to this. We'll get back to that later in the program. I want to turn now to Antonia and ask you, you were part of the research team on the Turnaway study that Brittany mentioned earlier. This study was a real landmark in understanding the impact of being denied abortion. Tell us what you learned.
Thanks, Carrie. So the Turnaway study, which we've already talked a little bit about today, is a study that was conducted by my colleagues and I out of UCSF. And it was conducted before the Dobbs decision, but it really, I think, sheds light into some of the impacts that we're probably going to see right now on people today. And the Turnaway study was a longitudinal study. It followed nearly 1,000 people, compared people who had an abortion to people who were denied an abortion, followed them for 5 years. And we looked at a host of different outcomes. And on all outcomes, we found that the people who were worse off were the people who were denied an abortion, not the people who had an abortion. We found that unlike a lot of the legislation and policy decisions that we see for a long time have held this assumption that abortion has adverse consequences to people's mental health. And unlike those, that assumption, we found the opposite. We found that denying people an abortion was worse off for people's mental health. They had more elevated symptoms of anxiety, low self-esteem, more stress due to being denied an abortion. And then we found that the people most vulnerable to experiencing adverse mental health consequences after having or being denied an abortion were people who had a history of mental health conditions, history of trauma and abuse. And it is those people that I worry the most about right now and are probably more vulnerable to experiencing adverse mental health consequences in the current context where their pregnancy options are taken away. And as I mentioned, we looked at so many different outcomes. We also looked at people's socioeconomic outcomes, physical health outcomes, and overall well-being. And we found that people who were denied an abortion were more likely to live in poverty, less likely to have enough money to cover basic living expenses like food, housing, and transportation. Their credit scores were lower, their debt was higher, and they were more likely to experience bankruptcies and evictions. And of course, these negative consequences extended to their children. Their children were also more likely to live in poverty and in households that were socioeconomically facing financial insecurity. We also found that the children in those households were less likely to reach developmental milestones, to experience poor maternal bonding. And we also examined the physical health consequences of abortion denial. So we already know that giving birth is a much more physically demanding experience than having an abortion. And we found this in the Turnaway study. So the people denied an abortion and went on to give birth were at much more higher risk of experiencing severe life-threatening complications like eclampsia, postpartum hemorrhage. And then we also saw what was very tragically 2 maternal deaths in the Turnaway study. So we had no deaths among the people who had an abortion, but 2 people who died following delivery, which is really an astronomical number. Our study is too small to look at maternal mortality rates, but it does just highlight how how horrible the consequences can be of denying people the right to choose what they want. And I think that when we think about the fact that these abortion bans are taking place in states that also have some of the highest maternal mortality rates in the country, they also are the ones that have the fewest mental health resources. We really can imagine that the outcomes right now are going to just be much worse by denying people right to choose.
Absolutely. Just a day or two ago, a report on Texas was released showing that infant mortality was also up. There was a 13% jump in infant mortality in Texas since they banned abortion, and a 23% jump in infant mortality due to congenital anomalies. So it's affecting both the pregnant people and infants. Were there any findings related to domestic violence and the impact on women's ability to leave abusive relationships if they were forced to carry an unwanted pregnancy to term?
We did. We found that about 5% of the people in our study were experiencing intimate partner, or 5% of the people in our study were experiencing intimate partner violence and were seeking abortion because of intimate partner violence, and about 1/3 were seeking abortion due to partner-related reasons, like not having a good partner or someone who was supportive. And it was the people who were denied an abortion who were more likely to stay tethered to those partners over time and to continue to be exposed to that abuse. Mm-hmm. And we also found, we looked at just relationship quality, and we also found that when people were able to get their abortions, they were more likely to be in relationships that would say they described as high quality relationships than the people who denied an abortion were also just in worse relationships over time.
Thank you, Antonia. Brittany, just a quick follow-up. On the NAF hotline, are you making more referrals to the National Suicide Hotline since abortion has been banned?
Yes, unfortunately, we are. So, as we've discussed, we know that making abortion care hard to access has very real impacts on people's mental health. And the National Abortion Hotline case managers hear and support patients every day as they manage fear, anxiety, and confusion, and how to navigate accessing abortion care in this really complex environment that we're in. They provide connections to a whole host of resources, including the National Suicide Hotline, to support patients as they navigate really impossible situations.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So, Stella, I want to come back to you. So we've been focusing on patients, but let's switch gears and look at how these bans impact obstetricians and gynecologists. What is it like to be an OBGYN right now?
Well, it's incredibly difficult. We're not trained we're trained. Well, I will start off. We are trained to take care of patients. We are caregivers, and we have expertise and skill to do that. We are not trained to be caring for patients where there's legislative interference, someone telling us what we can do in the sanctity of our exam room. And so, as an OBGYN, you have a patient in front of you who has a medical condition. And if, again, your hands are tied and you cannot provide the care you are trained to, that you know that will help that patient, that will protect that patient from becoming sicker, it's incredibly stressful. And then if a patient is deteriorating even faster, and you know that by the delay in care, they're going to become sicker and have a poorer outcome, that causes moral injury. That's stressful to watch somebody go through, and creates almost a PTSD, if you will, of going to work every day, scared at what you might have to face, where, how much is life-threatening, how much blood do you have to transfuse before you can actually take care of a patient. And then the effects of that, day after day, the sustainability of staying in an incredibly hard field. Being an obstetrician gynecologist, I've been one for, I've practiced for 23 years, incredibly rewarding, but it's challenging. It's not an easy job. And then you layer the stress of all of that on top of it. People are choosing to retire early, to leave this specialty. They're having to leave the states where they intentionally wanted to raise their family because, one, they cannot sustain it. The stress is too much. It's causing burnout. And then also, as they think about themselves, they have to think about their families. I mean, if they go to jail with criminalization of providing abortion care, and they can't take care of their kids, they have a partner or a spouse, they need to make difficult choices of leaving. And then what that does in those states where you're pulling out clinicians, we already have a workforce shortage coming up upon us, actually, and will get worse in the next several years. And then you're pulling providers, clinicians out of communities, rural communities especially, that don't have enough people to care for the population already. Then you're leaving fewer clinicians to care for the same population, a growing population. That is going to create more stress and burnout. We only have a certain number of hours in the day. We have less number of hands on deck to provide care, and the stress will also further worsen the access issues. And then when you look at people in training, so
Yeah.
I do think that our medical students, our residents, the advocacy piece is huge. People still want to help. They want to be caregivers, but it is affecting the choices of where they decide to do medical school, where they decide to do residency, because they're worried that they're not going to get the full aspect of training to provide full scope reproductive health care. And then we know that when you train in a place, you set down roots. You may end up staying there. That further gives back to the community in terms of access. Now, if we're not able to attract learners to those areas, how will we then continue to help improve the workforce in certain areas? So we're going to see, and we are seeing, these maternity care deserts, and it's incredibly challenging to practice in a time like this.
Absolutely. I saw research showing that medical students applying for residencies are applying less to places that ban abortion and applying more in places with legal abortion because they know this landscape and the impact that it'll have on them. but then it leaves people without care.
Yeah, and then also for those people who are training in those states, there is, work to be done to try to get those people who are training in those restricted states to states. I'm in Oregon, where they can train and get that training. However, there's fear of doing that, fear of traveling, the restrictions, and how do you support all of that?
Well, and the threat of criminalization hanging over your shoulder at all times, that to me must be just terrible. All right, I want to now turn back to Beth and talk a little bit about medication abortion. I mentioned at the beginning of the show that 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court issued a ruling that for now preserved access to mifepristone. Mifepristone is one of 2 abortion medications that are taken in conjunction to have an abortion in the first really 13 weeks. And 2/3 of abortions are now done with abortion medications. So Beth, can you tell us about this ruling and what's next when it comes to access to medication abortion?
Sure. This is the lawsuit that opponents to abortion brought to challenge actions by the Food and Drug Administration that expanded access to mifepristone. The Supreme Court ruled that the case, though, had to go back to the lower courts because the plaintiffs who brought the suit didn't have standing to bring it. That means that the folks who brought the case, physicians and other opposed to abortion, didn't have a right to bring the suit because they weren't injured by the actions of the FDA because expanded access by others to mifepristone did not injure them. The Supreme Court did not rule on the merits of the challenge, which is really important. And the abortion opponents relied on all types of junk science, inaccurate, purported evidence to try and challenge the very extensive science-based determinations that the Food and Drug Administration had relied on. So the court has now gone back to the lower courts. In the meantime, the status quo is maintained. So access to mifepristone remains through telemedicine and prescriptions that can be filled at pharmacies. And as you mentioned, Carrie, recent study demonstrated that last year in 2023, 63% of abortions were medication abortions. So this is critical. The lower court should now dismiss the case completely for lack of jurisdiction, but threat remains because states opposing abortion that have abortion bans are attempting to keep the case alive. They had intervened and been allowed to do that in the trial court earlier. So they're trying to keep that an active case. And they also have indicated they may bring another new suit if necessary to continue a challenge.
Can you speak about their argument to misuse the Comstock Act to restrict access to abortion? Because that was a key part of that. In addition to saying abortion pills were dangerous, which they're not, they made this argument about this 19th century anti-obscenity law being used for this purpose to ban abortion.
Yeah, absolutely. The safety of medication abortion is, unquestioned in the scientific realm. The Comstock Act is a very antiquated 1873 statute that abortion opponents are trying to misuse to restrict the shipping and sending of materials that are used for abortion to other states. And they're trying to misuse that as a national abortion ban, really as an end run around the democratic process, requiring no vote by Congress. Moreover, attempting to override the democratic processes we were just discussing in so many states that are affirmatively protecting abortion access under state law. The opponents to abortion in the mifepristone case had tried to raise arguments under this. The trial court, in fact, ruled in their favor. But the Court of Appeals, even though it ruled for the opponents, did not agree with that argument, did not rule on that argument. The Supreme Court also did not just rule on the merits to the challenge to the FDA actions, but also did not rule and did not even mention the Comstock Act. That is something, however, that would be featured in the Project 2025 that you asked about earlier,
Yes.
and a hostile administration.
Yeah, Project 2025 promises to have the new president direct the FDA to remove mifepristone from the market, but also enforce the Comstock Act against potentially not only abortion pills, but any instrument used to do abortion. So it could have an even wider scope. And it's, again, banning the mailing of these objects through interstate mail.
And I should just say that the Center for Reproductive Rights and other organizations are well prepared for any type of, attempted misuse. There are multiple grounds to demonstrate why that is not an appropriate interpretation of the law. So there are preparations, and folks are standing ready for that if the Comstock Act starts to get more traction.
Thank you so much, Beth. I want to turn to Antonio. Medication abortion is often reaching patients via networks outside of the formal medical system. And I know, Antonio, you've looked into this issue. Can you tell us what you've learned about how people are getting medications out, particularly in states that are banning abortion?
Yeah, sure. So we've seen, as you've mentioned, this is rapid expansion and people using medication abortion. And this has to do with a number of things. One is FDA lifted its in-person dispensing requirement due to the pandemic. And then we had the Dobbs decision, which bans abortion. And as now we just heard in so many states. And then we also had the implementation of SHIELD laws, which provide additional legal protections to clinicians in states with protected access to abortion. And so this led to a rapid expansion in telehealth abortion care, as well as online retailers who ship medication abortions to people living in every US state. So more people are using medication abortion through these telehealth and online models of care, and studies have shown that this is extremely safe and effective. But we also know that not everyone can travel to a facility to get abortion care. Not everyone has access to these telehealth and online models of medication abortion. And people who don't have access to those will consider ending a pregnancy on their own without medical assistance. And in our research before the Dobbs decision, we found that about a third of people accessing facility-based abortion care said that they would consider ending a pregnancy on their own if they didn't have access to care in a facility. And this was particularly held true, like even higher among people who were seeking abortion due to concerns about their own physical or mental health. And then also before the Dobbs decision, my colleague Lauren Ralph and I estimated the national prevalence of how many people would consider, or how many people had attempted to self-manage abortion. And we estimated that 7% of women, people who self-identify as women, attempted to self-manage abortion using a range of methods. So some of them, about half of them, use medication abortion, but then also more concerning, about half were using traumatic methods such as physical force, as well as herbs and other drugs. And we have repeated that national study since Dobbs and did a pre-post comparison and found that more people are turning to self-manage their abortions. And they're not just using medication abortion, which is very safe and effective, but they're also using potentially unsafe and ineffective methods. And the results of this study will be coming out soon. But just to say that there is definitely an increase. And then while I have sort of said that that self-managed abortion with medication abortion can be extremely safe and effective, I also think it's important to highlight the growing concern that self-managed abortion can be legally risky. And of course, those legal risks are more prevalent among structurally marginalized and oppressed communities, especially those that are already being targeted by the criminal justice system. And also, which all just as a reminder for providers and for all of us to be aware that we are not under an legal or ethical obligation to participate in the criminalization of patients.
Thank you, Antonia. Thank you. So now I want to talk about one of the greatest threats to the rights and health of pregnant people, the fetal personhood movement. Brittany, where do you see this heading? Can you say a little bit about this?
Sure. So I think this is really interesting because the Dobbs decision supposedly returned the decision about abortion to the states, but we've always known the truth, and that is that anti-abortion advocates and politicians goal is to ban abortion nationwide, and fetal personhood is one of the most extreme ways to be able to do that. We're seeing that these sorts of extreme and once fringe viewpoints are actually coming to the forefront of the anti-abortion movement. So I think it's really important that we remain clear-eyed and ready and understanding of what's to come. Fetal personhood is the concept of giving fetuses and embryos the same rights that you and I have, and in some cases giving them more rights than women and pregnant people. And this is extremely concerning because it would essentially serve as a ban, a total ban on abortion, potentially from the point of conception. I think it's also goes to show that abortion is just one piece of what the anti-abortion movement is really looking to ban. We have seen over the past 2 years that there have been increasing attacks on birth control, as was talked about earlier today, an attempt to reclassify contraception as abortifacients to try to ban those as well. And there's also attacks on IVF. And I want to be really clear that birth control, IVF, and abortion are supported by the vast majority of Americans. These attacks are calculated, they are extreme, but they're also strategic. They fly in the face of good medicine and what we know to be true about how most Americans think and feel about these very personal issues. And it's no coincidence that the people who are most impacted by abortion bans are the people who can least afford it. It's people of color, young people, people with lower incomes, immigrants. And I think it's important to understand that, yes, this is about abortion, but it's about so much more than abortion. It's about power and it's about control, because when you can control a person's ability to make their own decisions about their bodies and their lives, you can control the future of entire communities. And the fact that there is such a disproportionate impact on the marginalized communities that we just talked about, I think is really telling in terms of what the true goals of anti-abortion politicians and advocates are, and that is control over these marginalized communities.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brittany. Another anti-abortion strategy that's gaining traction is the increasing prevalence and state funding of crisis pregnancy centers. Stella, can you tell us about these centers and how you're seeing it among your patients, the misinformation that they're spreading?
Yeah, well, so these are health centers or health clinics that are not legitimate. They represent themselves, they market themselves as a legitimate reproductive health center, but they actually, their intent is to dissuade people from accessing abortion care, accessing contraception care. They spread misinformation. They talk about fake side effects when they're talking about abortion. They may talk about how it increases your risk of breast cancer or it increases your risk of infertility. They also, once you're in the doors, will frequently shame people. They will, emotionally manipulate people to get them to not do an abortion. They also, they're not regulated. So there's nothing, there's no HIPAA protections. They have no legal obligation to provide evidence-based care. And some examples of how they dissuade people from getting the care they deserve, or at least having the option to the care they deserve. they may do an ultrasound, and maybe that ultrasound is not accurate as to what the gestational age of a pregnancy is. And you're living in a state with a ban with a gestational age restriction. So then now all of a sudden you think you're not allowed to access abortion care or even at a neighboring state. So they spread misinformation, they cause fear, they cause shame for patients, and they're not legitimate. And it's a way to, again, not allow people who maybe can't travel and they're lulled into these reproductive health centers, which again are not based and providing science-based care.
Thank you, Stella. So now we've talked a lot about distressing news today and kind of where we are, but I want to ask each of you what you do to stay hopeful and focused on your work in this environment. Can we start with Beth?
I have to say, I look to our clients. When Stella was talking earlier about the challenges that face OBGYN and other abortion providers, is so compelling to me. Every day, I am so impressed and just encouraged and inspired by the clients. In our Texas exceptions cases, in addition to representing 20 patients who were horribly, put in these horrible situations and denied a delayed abortion care, we represent the physicians who are, trying to provide evidence-based care to their patients and are facing, significant criminal sanctions and being second-guessed by legislatures with absolutely no medical experience. And of course, I'm inspired by our individual patients as well, who are our clients and just are willing to step forward and share the most private aspects of their lives because they understand they want to do it for other people who are facing similar situations.
Yeah, I found reading the stories of those plaintiffs so inspiring that they're standing up and not letting this happen. Yeah. Antonia, what about you? What makes you hopeful, if you are?
Well, yeah, it's, you have a little bit of work to find that hope, but no, I mean, I think one of the things that we also are facing, along with all of these challenges, we're also seeing a lot of positives in terms of bringing people together and really fighting for this work. And, at the state level, seeing states enshrining abortion and abortion rights, sorry. And then also, I think we do have some innovations in medication abortion, which are really exciting. Advanced provision of medication abortion, I think, is an important innovation that we can add to the menu of options. And it's beginning to be, we're seeing, emerging evidence of its use and that it has the potential to facilitate improved access to early abortion care. And the other is over-the-counter access to medication abortion, which I know sounds like such a pipe dream, particularly in this particular policy environment that we're living, but we're doing work out of UCSF. We're with Dan Grossman. He was also one of the people who was involved in moving over-the-counter, moving oral contraceptives over the counter, and that did just happen.
Yeah.
So that's super exciting. But so he's had this vision, a 10-year vision. We started this work 5 years ago of building the evidence to move medication abortion over the counter. And, not surprising to you all, I don't think, but we are finding, we've done label comprehension studies and we're about to do an actual use study where we're showing that people, including young people and people with low literacy, can understand label instructions and self-assess their pregnancy duration with relative accuracy. And I think one day, I don't know when, but that it will move over the counter, and that's super exciting. And then I just also want to say, like, with all of these innovative models, we also really need to, while they definitely have the potential to increase access, we always have to be mindful that they also have the potential to exacerbate existing inequities and disparities. And it's really important that we ensure that these new models of care are reaching the most structurally marginalized and oppressed individuals. And it's something, I mean, that even, right now, when we talk about medication abortion, reaching people through these online models and telehealth models, it's not reaching everyone. And so those are just things to always keep in mind. But I'll keep it positive. That's my positive note. I'm excited about this new research.
Thank you, Antonia. What about you, Brittany? What do you do to stay hopeful?
So probably spend time with my family, especially my daughters. I think I can very easily see how you can fall into despair, especially thinking about the fact that my girls have less rights today than I had. However, they're why I do this work, and they give me hope to try to build a better future. And I think about hope not just as a feeling, but really as a practice. And so needing to remain disciplined, to practice hope and use it as fuel for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. And Stella, what keeps you hopeful?
Well, I'm lucky that my day job keeps me hopeful. I get to see patients most days of the week, and I get to care for them. I am lucky that I live in Oregon where I have the largest protections and I'm able to get people the care they want and need. And also my colleagues. So while again, I live in Oregon, I get my other job as president of ACOG. I get to go around the country and talk to people around the country in restricted states and hear what they're doing. And while my friends in Texas, right, they're living in a very challenging, sad situation, they also are hopeful. They're taking it one day at a time. They're working to provide access, trying to expand access as much as they can, and they're not giving up. So I think having a strong community of patients, of OBGYN clinicians, and of your family and friends is very helpful. And then lastly, I'll say it's things like this. So when you get to go out, you get to have conversations, whether it's somebody I'm sitting by on a plane, whether it's here in a podcast, whether it's in an interview, getting the chance to educate and stop the misinformation out there and to talk about legislative interference on a larger scale and getting people's eyes to open and understand what that means for their access gives me hope.
Great. Good to hear. So I do want to ask folks if you have resources that viewers, for our viewers so that they can learn more about the issues that you specialize in. Are there sort of go-to places that are really high quality that you could recommend? Beth, what about legally? Where's the best place to go to get really concise explanations of the legal cases and what's happening legally?
I would say on our website, the Center for Reproductive Rights, we do have summaries of all of these cases. We have very useful maps that are a significant resource for folks in a lot of different areas around the country that show the laws in states after Roe. We also have specific state constitutional maps that we're trying to, where we're trying to build the jurisprudence. And it's an incredibly moving opportunity also to see videos and of the patients that we discussed. And for example, this amicus briefs that we filed in the Supreme Court that really lay out the moving situations and, really harrowing experiences that patients have faced.
Great. And just Guttmacher Institute also has legal maps that I think are very helpful. And they're doing research and publishing studies about like the number of abortions and what's happening in different states. They have a data center where you can study your own state to find out what's happening with regard to abortion, contraception, childbirth. That's a helpful resource too on law and sort of demographic information. Mm-hmm. Antonia, what about the cutting edge research? Where should people go?
I would, if you're interested in any of the research that I talked about or any other research related to abortion coming out of Answer, UCSF's Answer program, I would go to our website, which is answer.org. And we have some, summaries of some of the over-the-counter access work that we've been doing, self-managed abortion, and the Turnaway study, and as well as so much more.
Yeah, the Turnaway study was published as a book, and it is a riveting book. I signed it in my class and read the whole thing last semester, and it's people's stories, and it really gives you a sense of what's happening out there. So Thank you for that, Antonio. Brittany, what about in your area of abortion funding and getting people travel support and other resources?
Absolutely. So people can visit our website. It's pretty easy, prochoice.org, so easy to remember. For providers and students and fellows, we have a lot of really great resources that are available through the National Abortion Federation. Through the National Abortion Hotline, we offer abortion funding, travel support and assistance, practical support, and that can be found through our website or the hotline's number. So that's 1-800-772-9100. We also have some really great information about and resources that can be helpful to patients and providers, including a new resource on self-managed abortion.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. And I'll just put in a plug for plancpills.org, which has information about how people in all 50 states are accessing abortion pills. And even those living in states with bans, that's a really important resource as well. Stella, what about the medical side? Where can people learn more about what's happening medically?
So acog.org, so that is our website. We have a patient-facing website with lots of information about clinical guidance for patients. We have our policies. So I would say there's a plethora of information there, and it would ask patients to go there first, rather than doing a Google search on the internet where there is, or social media where there's a lot of misinformation spread.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.